Hi, welcome to Pegasus Research Substack Week in Review Unscripted number 33 podcast. I am Thomas, the founder of, the author for Pegasus Research. I'm an economist, a military historian, and a U.S. Army veteran. If you like my content and want to support my work, please consider becoming a subscriber on Substack or support me on Patreon or buy me a coffee. The website will be in the description section of this podcast. So you'll have to excuse me. My monitor is not working, so I'm not getting any feedback on how I hear. I just have a monitor, a screen that shows me what my voice waves are. So I'm assuming I'm coming across fine. I did test it, and there was kind of a weird echo. So I apologize for any technical issues with this broadcast. I want to thank you all for new subscribers. Thank you very much for joining. Had another paid subscriber. Thank you. I appreciate that. It's always a big help to keep this going, especially then I might have to buy a new monitor. I mean the audio monitor. And then my existing followers and subscribers, thank you for staying with me. I appreciate all your support over this time. So we have three articles. One is a continuation of last week's article. It was a two-parter. It was When Whistling Past the Graveyard Meets the Gloomy Science. Want to Annoy China? Propose an Asian NATO. And Take Me Back, I Love You, Turkish President Erdogan. Maybe. Okay, so the first one is the two-parter. You can listen to my thoughts on that on Unscripted number 32 podcast. It was the last discussion topic, so it's probably starting right around probably minute 55 of that podcast if you want to listen to it. This one definitely has more, in the paper, it has a lot more of the factors of production and how U.S. shipbuilding, this is what this is about, is how it's meeting with just the basic factors of production and economics. I'm an economist. So when you look at it, is the factors of production are land, labor, and capital. And if you are also got added later on was entrepreneurship. So those are the factors of production. So I tried to break down the issue of the anemic U.S. warship building back to those factors. Now, the one thing I go in there, so is, first off, economics is the gloomy science. It can provide insights into low production rates, lengthy lead times, cost overruns, and defense procurement, because it still comes down, as basic as it sounds, land, labor, capital, and entrepreneurship can just about explain any factor of producing a product. So that's kind of the power of economics, is no matter what if you can break down whatever you're trying to do into what it is, then that's going to determine how your business works. For example, this podcasting, for the most part, it does include land, labor, capital, and entrepreneurship. You could go into the capital as my computers, the internet access to, or that gives me internet access, this audio monitor that's not working. Entrepreneurship is the creativity I bring to this, trying to find an audience. Labor is the work that I physically do. Land is the location where I work. It doesn't take up much. So when you start breaking it down and you start understanding how you produce a product, then you can understand where you want to put the inputs in. So when it comes to U.S. shipbuilding, land, labor, capital, entrepreneurship. And so this one is heavy in economic theory. So if you checked out in economics class in college or high school, hey, I understand it. I would say that my graduating class for economics only had 8 graduates the whole year. So it's definitely not a popular category to talk in. But it does apply into the production of U.S. warships. So the U.S. has 12,000 miles of coastline. It does have a infrastructure of from prior, when it used to have a 600 ship or close to a 600 ship Navy, back in the Reagan administration in the 80s. It capped out at like 597 or something like that. It had a lot of those facilities to build those ships, maintain those ships. 12,000 miles of coastline. The issue with procurement right now or the production of warships in the United States, with all those old locations, a lot of them still exist because you can't just easily tear out a dry dock or any other facility like that, is we have all the old infrastructure to support a 600 ship Navy. We have 12,000 miles of coastline. Land is not an issue when it comes to the anemic production of U.S. warships. So I didn't really discuss that. Said, hey, when you've got the old infrastructure that we were able to support at one point, 12,000 miles of coastline, land is not the issue in creating warships. So at the end of the Cold War, as I talked about, and the U.S. had a goal of a 600 ship Navy, and that's when you saw the World War II battleships reintroduced. The Iowa, I won't go into all of them, Iowa, New Jersey, Missouri, Wisconsin were all brought back in. We still had diesel-powered aircraft carriers. And again, we just had a bigger Navy. The goal was a 600 ship Navy at the height of the Cold War, or I guess can't say the height, the closing chapters of the Cold War. Well, at the end of the Cold War, and then later on the War on Terror, first off with the Cold War, when that occurred, we didn't need a 600 ship Navy. So you go into, it's like the infrastructure that was meant to create ships to support a 600 ship Navy, and that infrastructure to service a 600 ship Navy, that was no longer needed. So what was happening is as you start seeing I think the current fleet is like right around 320 something from 600, is okay, at the end of the Cold War, we need to shrink the Navy, the appropriate decision to make. So that reduced orders. So these companies that were at one point looking at supporting a 600 ship Navy, both in constructing, so as an old ship retires, you're at 597. You're not really making your goal as anyway. So as one ship retires, another one needs to be built. Servicing ships, those had to go. As ships got older, you have to retire them. You need to replace them. Well, what happened was when you didn't need 600 ship Navy and you go down to 300 and something ships, well, then you don't start you can start when you retire some of your older ships. You don't need to replace them immediately. So you can drop a few hundred, basically cut your Navy in half. So you retire ships and you don't replace them. So that meant there's less orders going into these production yards that were supporting producing warships. So contracts were canceled because you didn't need to maintain that 600 ships. So you start canceling those other contracts because you didn't need to replace the retiring warships. And in fact, that you're going to force retirement of some other warships, especially your older categories. Eventually led to the retirement of all the diesel-powered aircraft carriers. So when they started doing that, we start reducing the numbers. Orders dry up. It's harder for companies to stay profitable. So what they started doing at that point was they started shuttering shipyards because they didn't have the work. So maybe you had a shipyard with, let's say, I'll just throw it out there. I'm not overly familiar with producing ships, but let's say you had 5 dry docks and you had a production facility to produce 5 ships at the same time. They may not necessarily be in dry dock, but then all of a sudden you get reduced to 2 because you just don't have the orders for it. And so here's a classic example of it is this: at the end of the Cold War, the U.S. was creating a new extremely advanced attack submarine, a nuclear attack submarine. And these are submarines that go out and sink ships and hunt other submarines. So the attack submarines were a new category to replace some of the older Los Angeles class attack boats. If you ever watched The Hunt for Red October, the USS Dallas is a Los Angeles class submarine. Just kind of movie buff thing out there. So they were going to create 29 Seawolf class nuclear attack submarines. And they again replaced the older Los Angeles classes. What happened was the end of the Cold War happened. So they went from deciding to produce 29. They canceled 26 of the orders and only produced 3. Certainly a useful added category of a practical application of technology, but that wasn't really the reason why. It already started laying down those 3 ships, and it would cost more they would have lost more by just scrapping the whole thing than just trying to complete those 3 ships. Again, there was still that practical application of technology to get to overcome as well. So that's an example of, okay, the Navy was going to think, hey, or the private companies that were supporting the navies were like, hey, okay, I get it. We've got 29 ships coming. So all of a sudden they go from 29 to 3. When you build up a workforce now, of course, you're not building all 29 at the same time. Maybe you're building 6 at the same time. Well, if you're only going to produce 3, then you have your future outlays are significantly reduced. So again, you didn't need as many capital ships, large warships to produce as you shrunk your Navy. The other one was the War on Terror. Here's another impact on it, the War on Terror, and this all goes somewhere. The War on Terror is we didn't need these big capital ships anymore. The need wasn't there as much as it in the defense budget. It was supporting Marines and soldiers in the field, air forces to do tactical bombing runs. So you didn't need those big expensive projects like heavy bombers. I mean, heavy bombers did serve somewhat in the War on Terror, but not in mass formations. You had one maybe delivering 1 or 2 bombs at a time, kind of circling, orbiting to call in fire. But you didn't need those large fleets. You certainly didn't need the B-2s. No knock on the B-2. I think it's a wonderful technology, but you didn't need those big projects in there. You didn't need an F-22, and that's probably one of the demise why the F-22 got cut so significantly and why we only have about 90-something of them instead of 700. But so you didn't need those big budget items, and that goes for warships. You didn't need to have you didn't spend a lot of money on building new warships when your budget was really designated towards supporting the troops in the field. So again, that dried up. It's like there's only so many defense dollars. Even in wartime, there's only so much defense dollars to go around, and you had to decide between making 1,000 MRAPs to protect soldiers from IEDs over building a continue to support development of a new frigate, for example. And that's not a real issue, but you're going to scrap the frigate development over having 1,000 MRAPs created. So that really put pressure on these capital goods. So again, warship budgets were cut as well to support the War on Terror because they just weren't needed for the mission. So what happened is as your demand drops because of the Cold War, just what I talked about, going from 600 to 300 ship Navy, War on Terror, putting further pressure on bringing around new armed forces. The production infrastructure experienced significant excess capacity because, again, they didn't have the orders. They were built to build 5 ships, but the total order is only 2. Well, then you got a lot of extra space. So they had a lot of excess capacity due to the lack of orders. And this led to shipyard closures or at least reductions in the size of what the shipyard could handle. A lot of shipyards still do a lot of upgrades, and they do some of the major support. So it's not like they completely go away if they don't have any orders. There's still some need reduced to support a 300 ship Navy. So it also meant that budgets were tight. So there was inadequate infrastructure upgrades to whatever structures they did have, and they had limited orders. They did not have the money built into those contracts because, again, they're trying to bid to get any type of work. So they're probably somewhat lowballing themselves. And, it's hard to sit there and think lowballing when you have a $900 billion defense contract. But there was that occurring is the defense contractors did not want to put a lot of money in infrastructure upgrades because first off, you don't know how many more of these orders, these are reduced orders. And so you going to find where you can cut back, and you can go into sit there and say, how much is your outbound flow, your product offsetting your fixed cost, which is all your infrastructure. Which again, your infrastructure, when you look at it, is it does take up land, but this is also a lot of capital equipment. This is all of your how to run your production facilities. Because you just don't say, hey, I have a shipbuilding. You have to build the capacity to do this. So a lot of the capital equipment that was used to support shipbuilding was basically allowed to either they scrapped it or they allowed it to fall into disrepair. And what they did leave, because again, there's a lot of pressure in the defense budget for ships, especially in the later term due to the war on terror, is they did not spend the money to upgrade their infrastructure. So when you start building a warship and your infrastructure is only working at 70%, that's going to slow down your production time, which is probably going to increase your labor rates because it takes more man hours, and you're going to have to probably do more maintenance on what infrastructure you do have. And that all gets tied into the product because it goes into the costs associated with the company that is building a new warship. Again, this is heavy economic theory. I'm not going to go deep down the weeds, but you could go into it. Just the idea is, as the warship production decreased for two reasons, Cold War and the War on Terror, we had a lot of slack infrastructure, so companies no longer had the money due to lack of orders to upgrade their facilities or even to keep them at all. Again, supply and demand, when you have less supply to produce in this case, produce a ship, and the demand starts rising, and you don't have the supply, again, being able to build the ships, your price is going to go up. And that's what we're experiencing is long lead times as prices go up. Lead times cost because you don't have all the facilities that you used to have. And the one facilities that you do have, they're higher to maintain because they were not kept in a their infrastructure was not kept up to standards. Another thing that went into this, and we've seen this is throughout, I know less about shipbuilding, but I know about the defense industry in general, is after the Cold War, you saw a lot of pressure on consolidation. For example, we used to have, when it comes to aircraft, I know aircraft better than I do shipbuilding. Again, I'm talking about economic theory and not necessarily into the weeds of production. Is we used to have, for example, you used to have Lockheed Martin, which eventually became Lockheed Martin, McDonnell Douglas, North American, Grumman, Boeing, Fairchild Republic. Let's see here. There's a Vought. They all used to make fighter aircraft for all the different services. But for the most part today, all you see that's making your major airplanes is you see Boeing. Northrop was another one. I'm sorry, which is actually Northrop and Grumman, and now it's Northrop Grumman. And so you pretty much the only ones that are making aircraft now, for the most part, are Boeing, because they bought, for example, McDonnell Douglas and Boeing. Then you have Lockheed Martin. Those are the ones that make aircraft for the most part. And then Grumman does some. Northrop Grumman does make some, and I think they're involved in the B-21, and they were involved in the B-2. So you only have three major companies anymore. So when they start adding, and this happened in the shipbuilding as well. So when you start adding companies, when they start consolidating, and you have low dropping defense budgets for large capital equipment projects like making warships, what happens then is as they consolidate, they look to make themselves profitable, to justify the cost they spent on consolidating, is they look for duplicate services. So if you buy the let's say General Dynamics boat division, which makes submarines, let's say they had the capacity to buy 5, and then they bought maybe some capacity from another company have the capacity to build one. So all of a sudden you have the capacity to build 6 submarines, but you only have orders to support 2. Well, you're going to close down that one company, and then you're probably going to reduce your ability. So you're going to start building to leverage your fixed costs to make yourself profitable. Again, these are public companies, so they do have something with their shareholders where they have to show a profit. So what they do is they start shutting down the duplicate services capabilities. So all of a sudden, yeah, we used to have a shipbuilding that could support the building of 6 submarines split between 2 companies, and they combine into one company. They shut down the assets of the other one. Maybe they just want some of the I don't know, manufacturing know-how from that other company, and then they still have 5 and they can only support 2. So maybe they're going to drop to 3. So consolidation through the business, it ended up reducing capacity or submarine building capacity from 6 ships or boats. Boats for submarines to 3. And that's the type of consolidation you saw, because again, they have to be able to show some form of profit. So they can't just keep maintaining a shipyard without orders. That is going to be first off, you'll deleverage your fixed costs. Your fixed costs is going to be your facilities to make this that you've already paid for to make. I know there's different ways you can go into fixed costs and all that, but basically your facilities that make submarines, if you sit there and have the ability to make 5 and you have to pay the infrastructure to maintain 5, but you only have 2, you're deleveraging your costs. So they have to find some way to make themselves look profitable. That means reducing the amount of capacity they have. With that, out goes the labor, and we'll come back and talk about labor here as well. So the one thing they've run into is that the Congress and the U.S. Navy are looking at this, and this is a concern, and it's been in the news for quite some time, and actually it's been discussed for quite a while that they knew this was coming. And this is something that they really should have been thinking about, in my opinion, 25 years ago. Because for example, the Ford class aircraft carrier, I knew it was the first one. It was laid down in 2007, or procured in 2007, basically put into the budget. And then it was laid down, and it came out I think it was commissioned in 2017. It did not finish its first active duty till 2024. So it went from procurement to first tour was 17 years. So if you start looking in there, and this is what you run into all these new categories, we're upgrading most of the triad, which includes building new submarines to replace the old Ohio classes. So you need to start thinking about this, probably to be safe, 25 years in advance when it takes that long to build a new ship. Now, the next Ford class carriers, which I think is the next one is the John F. Kennedy, it won't take as long, but it will still take a while. The Columbia class that's replacing the Ohio class, which is the strategic ballistic missile submarines, those take 84 months to build, 7 years. They think they might be able to eventually get it down to 6 years for one, and they're only building one right now. So this is a significant issue that they have, and this is where the lack of foresight, that when you've got something that takes long from drawing board to production and deploying it to the fleet, these are very long lead times. Right now we're trying to build a new destroyer, a new frigate, eventually to replace the Block 1 and 2 Arleigh Burke class destroyers. We're going to the Ticonderoga class guided missile cruisers are all eventually going to be decommissioned. So when you plan this out, this has to be a long lead time, because from drawing board to putting it into the fleet is a long time, especially for the lead boats and the classes, or lead ships and classes. Boats for submarines, ships for capital ships. So U.S. Navy and the Congress are aware of this, and they're considering some ways to increase ship construction infrastructure And they're going to run it very similar to how the U.S. Army makes bullets and artillery rounds. The Army basically is responsible for building the infrastructure needed to make bullets and artillery shells. They do not put it on private companies to maintain that. So that means these private companies do not have to worry about trying to leverage their fixed assets to produce. So if the Army is only going to buy 2 billion rounds of ammunition this year instead of 4 billion, well, you just cut back on your workforce and maybe you look at shuttering part of your production capacity. Well, in this case, what the U.S. Army does, and again, artillery shells, and they're stepping up artillery shell production because it's needed for the war in Ukraine, if nothing else, to restock our supply of mainly 155 millimeter artillery rounds. Well, what happens is the U.S. Army arranges for the production of those facilities, and then the Army leases it out to a private company to run. So, for example, most of your 5.56 rounds, NATO rounds, are made out of this one factory. I wish I could remember the location, and it's run by a private company on a rotating basis. So you might have Winchester running it 1 year, and then maybe 5 years later that contract goes up, and Remington starts running it. So they just lease it out so these companies don't have to worry about maintaining the. I think they are responsible for some maintenance, but for the most part, they're not responsible for the large capital part. They're there to provide the labor to keep it running. The U.S. Army does not do the labor part. They do not do that planning and production. They just provide the infrastructure. So if the Army decides that they want to maintain or increase production by 20%, they build the infrastructure to do so, and then they contract a private company to do the actual production. So I mean, again, the private company is not responsible for building that the excess capacity or maintaining the infrastructure. That falls on the Army. Now that comes at a cost, obviously, because that means the government makes the decision that they are going to keep up that infrastructure, even though maybe at a particular point in time they don't need it. But if you get into, let's say, again, and let's hope not, but let's say you get into a shooting war and you're going to start using up a lot of 5.56 and 7.62 light caliber ammunition for the Army and the Marine Corps, you don't want to spend 5 years waiting for production, and people at the front and soldiers and Marines at the front are counting bullets because they only have 30 rounds to expend. One thing about the U.S. is that we shoot a lot of rounds when it comes to war. So they want to make sure that they have meaning the units that are deployed in this case have the bullets, and there's not a ration issue, and you're not waiting 5 years to make production. They missed it on the artillery stuff, doing the expenditures of 155 and the millimeter in the war in Ukraine. But the idea is that the Army maintains the infrastructure, not the private company. Again, that means the cost is passed on to the government, and it is somewhat inefficient because maybe they don't need that infrastructure. Maybe they've run a shift there and not fully utilizing all the capital that they have available or the land available with labor, but they basically lets the cost structure of maintaining or building up infrastructure to build more, in this case, more artillery or bullets, is not to the private company, it's on the government. The U.S. Navy is looking at the same thing, is paying for shipyards and paying for that infrastructure. And basically the government sets it up, and then the government leases it out to, again, Bath Iron Works, and I think they're in Maine. So they create the facilities, and then they let the private company build ships under government contracts within government facilities that the government is responsible for maintaining. Again, that takes the fixed cost structure of leveraging your fixed costs. Basically, leveraging fixed costs means you have enough production capacity to justify the facilities that you own. It takes that out, puts it onto the government. So that would overcome a lot of the questions. So the Congress is in actually addressing this issue. They're just looking at it the ways of, okay, let's take over some of the infrastructure so that we don't run into a situation that in the ebbs of flow of building ships, that we all of a sudden lose our ability with infrastructure, which is what we have now going on. So that's something that they're looking at doing. It's not approved yet. It will increase deficits, of course, unfortunately. But right now, the concern is being able to produce enough ships. The U.S. government, because again, they can print money. They didn't have the foresight. The idea is not so much it's a budget issue, it's a production issue that they need to address. So they're looking at ideas that they're willing to pay that extra cost to build those ships. The concern is, even at the extra cost, they're not really picking up their production rate. So they're looking at things that they can do now and in the future to keep this from ever happening again. So the other thing that we run into is labor. Okay, just talked about briefly. When you go into labor or into your lack of work, and so you start shuttering a lot of your land and labor, land and capital parts to make warships, you start degrading. You don't need the labor either. So what happens is you just go ahead and you just move the labor out. So they lay them off. They go off and do other things. Now the problem is that the U.S. only makes about 0.5% of the world's tonnage of ships in the world. China by far is the biggest producer. South Korea, Japan I think are 2 and 3. So it's hard for the U.S. to be able to make warships or any ships cost effectively. Can't compete with the Asian countries. So what happens is when you lay off these workers from these warship production plants, because again, you went from a 600 ship Navy to a 300 ship Navy. You had the war on terror. You didn't have those orders. You have all that going on. So you just go ahead and you lay off the labor. Now, shipbuilding is a very specialized form of labor, or certain parts of it are very specialized. It's a very specialized industry. Now, if we had a larger shipbuilding industry, not just warships, but in general, what you could do is you could just substitute labor. You could just say, hey, we lay off these people because we don't have a defense contract, and eventually they filter over to another industry to help build private ships. What happens is that's probably a flood of labor into that market for civilian ship building, which means that labor rates will in general decline, which should be able to reduce or make U.S. shipbuilding somewhat more competitive. But we don't have that because we don't have a significant shipbuilding sector. So that when you lay these people off, these specialized labor, they're gone. They have to go find other jobs. They can't just go into shipbuilding again. They have to go find other work. Maybe they find other shipbuilding yards. But the pressure is across the whole sector. So these workers, these specialized labor, or many of them are specialized, they just go on. And eventually, as long as this has been going on, many of them have retired. And again, there's not enough apprenticeships in these programs to bring in younger workers to work with more experienced workers to start learning, improving the skill sets needed for shipbuilding. That labor's gone. Your pool of building up new workers to take place, to be able to get trained, get the experience and the specialization to take it over, that pool has been greatly depleted. So you have fewer workers, and the workers that you do have cost more because their labor is more specialized. So they can demand a higher rate from the companies because, again, they supply and demand. There's a lot less of this labor that's specialized. You can't just simply go over to the high school at graduation and pull a bunch of these workers to expect them to start building ships right out of high school. It doesn't happen. It takes time to train these people, and they don't have that. So through all this shipbuilding or reduction in shipbuilding, you basically, much of your labor left the industry. And by the time you wanted to start bringing it back, there was no there was no work for them to do, or by the time you could bring it back, many of them had retired. I'm sorry, because there just wasn't work to do in the meantime. So eventually they went to other sectors, and many retired. And again, because we don't have a large shipbuilding industry, what used to be, let's say, for example, in World War II, we used to create a lot of warships, or I'm sorry, a lot of ships in general. When the war stepped up, a lot of those production facilities that made civilian ships started making warships. Well, we don't have that now. We don't have to be able to transfer labor or even facilities from civilian shipbuilding over to military shipbuilding. We don't have, because we don't have either one of those. So you don't really have that much capacity to take from the civilian sector, and you don't have the labor to take from the civilian sector to be able to help you build more warships more quickly. So by not building in the past and not being able to find some way to maintain that infrastructure, to maintain that trained workforce, or use any type of ways to be able to try to replace that workforce, what you ended up was doing was you basically just vacated a lot part of your production. And because it takes so long to build these ships, the government, through lack of foresight, and maybe private companies not pushing back on Congress, say, hey, this is what could happen, just looking to be able to save. They weren't saving money. The government was not saving money. They were just spending it somewhere else. They just allowed this to happen. And through no foresight, now they're in a position where they're having to produce more. They need more warships, and we can't produce them anywhere near fast enough with all the tensions going in China, which has the biggest Navy in the world now. Probably not as capable as the U.S. Navy, but it's bigger. So the other thing is that they'll be able to do is that, again, as the Congress and the Navy are looking at it, they're looking at it for a couple things. They're looking at it as like doing the same thing, is how can we create incentive programs to train people early on and be able to attract labor that maybe has some specialization. Maybe, okay, for example, maybe you need welders to help to work on building a warship. Maybe you can pull welders from that build, I don't know, railroad cars. You pull them from that sector, and you train them into shipbuilding. Their basic skill is welding, and you try to be able to train that make it a little bit more specialized for welding in shipbuilding. So that might be a program that the Navy and the Congress are looking at doing. The other thing they're looking at, this is highly controversial, and it does cause some issues. I'm not promoting it. I'm not saying it's good or bad. It's just, this is what they're looking at. Legal immigration for foreigners. So basically, you've got some people, you got skilled workers in, let's say, South Korea or India that have shipbuilding skills, because they still build ships in those countries. You bring them to the U.S. as legal immigrants, and you have them start filling jobs in the U.S. to start building U.S. ships. Now, just me saying that, you see how controversial that is. There are also some laws about U.S. Defense work going to Americans and going to American companies. So there's some legal aspects of it. But it is a way, if you are short on labor and you don't have the labor pool to pull from the United States, yeah, you might have to go to foreign countries. Now, issues is you're talking about defense work. So as you start building more and more into the defense work, there is sensitive information. So are those foreigners going to be able to pass security backgrounds? Or even for even the most basic levels, can we do criminal background checks? So there's a lot of controversy in it. And when you're talking about military, there is some sensitivity in the technology and even in the production techniques in the U.S. that are maybe somewhat sensitive, that they don't want to spread around. So that's an issue with bringing in foreign workers as well, though it could address the labor gap. So the other way that they could get around the labor issues is through some form of entrepreneurship. So you can go in there and start looking at robotics. Ships are built one at a time. They're not like a car where you just run it down the assembly line and this worker does this particular part to the car as it works its way down on a conveyor assembly. Ships are not built like that. They're manufactured in one location. But maybe you can look at robotics, which is a little bit harder to set up in something like a warship. The other one is making modular manufacturing. The U.S. has been doing this. I think BAE Systems as well over in Europe. And it's modular. So instead of having one big shipyard doing all the work and creating the ship, maybe you have parts made in other parts of the country, maybe that don't necessarily have shipbuilding skills, but maybe have some form in metal work or something like that they can actually use some of that industry, and then the shipbuilders actually put together all the modular pieces. So that's something they're looking at as well, and expanding that to be able to pull in, if you can't increase your shipbuilding capacity due to labor constraints and the time it takes to update the infrastructure to support more shipbuilding, maybe you can look at pulling from other industries that can make parts for warship production without to basically try to compensate for your labor. Robotics is, again, a possibility. Hard to see how they have to create it without having to create a significant improvement to infrastructure to get there. But it would solve a lot of your long-term problems doing that. Again, diversified manufacturing is, okay, you make the, I don't know, I know where turrets are not near as big, gun turrets are not near as big as they used to be. Okay, this gun turret is made in such and such place, and then it's transported over, dropped onto the warship. The maybe the warship is divided up into 50 different modular sets, and 50 different modules are made, and then they're assembled at the shipyard. So those are all things that are being done, but can also be expanded. The other one is creating smaller warships that have very specialized capabilities. So they talked about is right now the smallest ship we have in the U.S. is the destroyers. Our destroyers are pretty big compared to other countries' destroyers, but they call them destroyers because just mainly not for size, but for capabilities. Well, creating corvettes. If you create smaller warships, you could maybe use some of the facilities that are used for creating maybe smaller ships, whether for the military, for let's say landing craft or something like that. Maybe they have the ability to be able to handle building a corvette, which is something smaller than a destroyer. It would be highly specialized. Maybe they're corvettes that specialize in just anti-air or anti-missile, or maybe build corvettes just for anti-submarine warfare. So you could become very specialized ships. Seaworthiness becomes a problem too when you start creating, but we've built corvettes in the past. We meaning the modern navies of the world have used corvettes, and they can be used into a blue water navy. But that's an option too, just create smaller warships. The other one is what they're doing in Project 33 right now from the Chief of Naval Operations. Her project is Project 33, and that's creating more autonomous warships. Again, just like when it came to the corvette building a smaller warship, autonomous warships are much smaller. They don't need to have crew quarters. They don't need to have facilities for crews. They don't need to have sleeping bays. They don't need to have the space. You don't have to have a bridge to hold 10 people because it's all automated. So you can make this smaller. And when you make it smaller, you can make it lighter. When you make it lighter, you can have less fuel. Less fuel means you can make the thing even lighter. And then you don't have to worry about, for example, NBC environment, nuclear, biological, and chemical. Obviously, you have to think about from biological, chemical perspective. It's going to be immune. Nuclear is a whole different thing, but you don't have to have the sealed systems like you would have for chemical or biological, where you can seal a warship up to be protect the crew from, let's say, chemical warfare. You don't need that for an autonomous ship. So these are things that can make the autonomous ship smaller. If they're smaller, they can be almost as capable as a full-size warship at a much smaller size. That means it takes fewer people to create, and maybe to the point that it's so small that you could probably bring in more robotics and use shipyards that are something other than the traditional shipyards that have to build ships that are manned. Autonomous warships cannot replace right now anywhere in the next 25 years to completely replace the manned warship. But it's something that they're looking at. So these are all things, that's on the entrepreneur side. Basically look at alternate ways of manufacturing, either make the ship smaller or to reduce the amount of labor needed to create the ship itself. Also, smaller ships can tend to be produced quicker. So that means whether these robotics or these corvettes, you can make them quicker. And instead of let's say you're turning out an Arleigh Burke, I think they turn out, one Arleigh Burke takes a year and a half to, maybe just over a year and a half to make. You can make a Corvette in 7 months. So in the time, for example, you're making almost 3 Corvettes for every one Arleigh Burke at some point because they are much smaller warships. So those are things that they can do to look at. So it really comes into is that finally it's just the whole issue is about capacity and the rising cost is because of just what I said. They allowed the infrastructure to shrink. Also, when you start sitting there and talking about a warship taking longer to build, that rises the cost because it's taking up time in a shipyard. Instead of being produced quickly, it's being produced slowly because there's not enough capacity where you can only build one at a time. Where you can take efficiencies and use some specialization where if you can build them multiple times, you don't have that because you allowed the infrastructure to shrink. And then you don't have the labor pool because you allowed the infrastructure to shrink for warship production and all the infrastructure itself, like the power and water and all that to go into decay because you didn't have the orders. So again, when you don't have all that, then the labor goes away. So you've just basically created this situation where it takes longer to build. That means when you take longer, it's taking up more space in the location. It probably uses more relative labor because it's sitting there for whatever reason. For, let's say, for example, you're waiting for parts because you have a supply chain that is no longer set up to support a 600 ship Navy, but a 300 ship Navy. And so it takes longer to get parts as you're trying to ramp up production. Now that you're not getting the 600 ship Navy, but you need to speed up production. Well, those supply chains that produce some of those goods can't immediately ramp up. They also have some of the same issues with their infrastructure. So then they have to pick that up. Well, so all of a sudden you're building up a ship that, let's say they get the parts, normal lead time was 14 days, now it's 30. Your labor, you're not going to lay your labor off. And most of them are union. You're not going to sit there and send them home with no work to do and not pay them. You got to pay them for sitting there and not doing anything. Not because of fault of their own. It's because they can't, the lead times are longer to get products. And also because you don't have the infrastructure to bring on more, to build more ships at the same time, where you could actually have the companies speed up their production to justify more orders. You could have them speed up production and again reduce your lead times. So there's all these lumps and the producing ships that just increase the amount of time to take to do these ships. Again, this was a 25-year problem at least that needed to be thought through before you got to this point, and they did not do it. So this is really self-inflicted. It's a lack of foresight. I get it. Cold War didn't need a 600 ship Navy. Get it. You didn't need to worry about building, updating your nuclear armed forces. But as you, nuclear armed forces for, let's say, your submarine launched ballistic missiles. So you didn't need those boomers or those ballistic missile submarines. You didn't need to produce them at such a rate. But you allowed the infrastructure that creates that to fall along with its labor. And now you're in a position where you can't produce these at a rate that you need to, at a rate that security says you need to, because you never had the foresight that maybe something could go on in the Western Pacific that maybe you needed to be able to address on a rapid basis. You didn't maintain the Navy, get it. You didn't need the ships at the time, but not having the infrastructure to be able to ramp up within, say, okay, you see this problem 10 years out? Oh, okay, let's start getting these orders out, start ramping up production, and then we'll be able to do it. When you look at the World War II, for example, they started reading the tea leaves, and because the World War II ship did not take as long to build, and again, we had a lot more ability to change labor and specialization between civilian and military. those SX carriers were not started building. They did not start getting built on which the SX carrier was the one that really, along with some of the smaller carriers, but the SX was the big one. Those SX carriers that came online starting in 1943 were the ones that tipped the balance in the war in the Pacific in World War II. Those things weren't started to say, hey, we need to build December 8th, 1941, the day after Pearl Harbor, saying, yeah, I think we need to build some SX carriers. We'll bang these out in 2 years and we'll be good. No, those things there was forethought in that the U.S. Navy needed to increase after the hangover of the Great Depression. And you go back and they had a big Navy at the end of World War One. A lot, they traded some of the ships back over to the British for rights to sell or to basing rights within the Caribbean from the British. But for the most part, they were kind of in the same position where they allowed a large Navy to basically decrease. Again, the advantage is the U.S. was still one of the biggest manufacturers of civilian shipbuilding. But the point is, they had the foresight prior to World War II to be able to say, hey, we need to build new carriers, and we're going to build them in a number that we've never done before. Now, some people will sit there and say, okay, well, that means World War II was planned. No, I think it's probably just reading the movement inside the world as far as, again, Japan was active in China all the way starting in the early 1930s. So the war winds were blowing, and they kind of read into that they needed to have a future capacity for a potential of another world war. So did not do that this time. Again, this is not a problem with the Biden administration or the Trump administration. This goes back all the way to George W. Bush and Barack Obama's first term, that they should have been addressing this issue before it became a problem, or created a foreign policy that was one that would avoid conflicts altogether. Not saying that was the right thing to do, but their foreign policy mismatched with the abilities of U.S. production to be able to make ships. And so there should have been foresight in how they wanted to address this, and there wasn't. This thing should have been figured out 25 years ago. So that's my rant on that one. Hope that made a little bit of sense. I didn't want to get too much into labor because you can go down a rabbit hole about this. I probably could have wrote 10,000 words on it. I limited it to 2,000. So, all right. So next one is want to annoy China, propose an Asian NATO. Now, China has been talking about this for quite some time. They always threatening that NATO's coming to Asia, or there's going to be an Asian NATO. And it's been a concern of the Chinese for quite some time. The Chinese their basic position in their life, is they want all, and I've talked about this several times, especially in the West Philippine Sea newsletter, is they want all negotiations, whether over a dispute or whether it's through trade, they want everything on bilateral talks. And bilateral talks is when and this is in Asia, bilateral talks with China, for the most part, is China has the biggest military, they have the biggest economy. They have all the leverage coming in there. So if somebody like Brunei wants to negotiate with China, China says, well, you can only negotiate with me being China one-on-one. You have all the advantages, because you can threaten military and economic punishment to a country entering into a dispute with you. The idea is with collective security is it eliminates where if China goes in there over, let's say, some dispute and there's a collective defense agreement in place in the Western Pacific, well, China can't threaten that country with war, because threatening that country with war brings war about from the whole countries of the collective defense structure. So that takes away, it doesn't necessarily take away the economic part, but you can't threaten the country with military power in any type of negotiation or dispute, because that would bring in a collective response. So not something, Doesn't mean that China will be defeated, but it changes China's approach. It changes call it their calculus of how far they're willing to go to threaten another country. So the prior prime minister of Japan had resigned last month, and he was replaced by Shiguro Ishiba, who was his defense minister. I think if I remember, he was defense minister at one point. I think he was the prior defense minister, became the new prime minister. Now it's only temporary because they do have to have new elections. They've gone through them already, and he's still the prime minister, but his party does not have an outright majority, so they have to form some type of coalition. So he may or may not stay as the prime minister. But anyway, he is probably the most hawkish Japanese prime minister since maybe World War II. And he's proposed an actual Asian NATO. Now, as collective defense strategy. Now, this is not NATO extending into Asia. This is an Asian version of NATO, which is, again, a collective defense alliance. I have to say that because there's something called the IP4, Indo-Pacific 4, which is Australia, New Zealand, South Korea, and Japan. They all form a NATO partnership called IP4. And many of them have programs with NATO. So when we're talking about an Asian NATO, it's the concept of a NATO type structure in Asia and not NATO extending into Asia, which is one of the things that China always talks about, is that NATO wants to move into Asia. That's not the case. I've talked about that before, about capacity and all that. And so it's not really even a practical possibility. So again, this has been something that he's suggested. Now there's benefits to it and there's downside of it. So obviously China is highly opposed to it. They've already stated it. They basically have pre-warned about this. Prime Minister Ishiba has said it anyway. So it's just, again, a different approach. China wants bilateral process. Japan wants a multilateral process. Now, this is part of the reason it comes into is that Japan, since the end of World War II, and basically since when the Japanese were able to reform a government in 1950, I believe, Japan's whole foreign policy has been based on two factors: is internationalism and the U.S.-Japanese defense alliance. So that's what their whole foreign policy, and their constitution says, they, being Japan, their constitution states that they are not allowed to deploy armed forces overseas. Now, that was very strict, but it's slowly been loosening. So the Chinese or Japanese point of view is they still have to stay within their constitution about deploying armed services overseas. But the outs that they have been using, and one is to sit there and say, is if it's in promotion of the U.S.-Japanese Defense Alliance, it's allowed. If it's part of internationalism, it's allowed. So the idea is, let's say, for example, the Japanese signing a reciprocal armed forces agreement with Philippines. That is, again, that's internationalism, but it's really just a bilateral relation. So they can't really say it's internationalism, but what it is, it supports the U.S. Japanese Defense Alliance, because the kind of tied into it is Philippines also have a defense alliance with the United States. So they're not in competition with each other. And in this case, they're talking about limiting or countering the Chinese actions in the West Philippine Sea and the South China Sea and the Yellow Sea as well. So that's how they kind of fall into, that's how they have to approach all their foreign policy, because, again, they still have that constitutional requirement that they can't deploy forces overseas. So they basically cannot act on their own. They have to be part of internationalism. That could be, again, an example of that would be Japan can be part of a UN peacekeeping force. That's allowed. That's under internationalism. And then the other one is the U.S.-Japanese Defense Alliance, and that's the way they get around stuff. So his philosophy, and so this, let me go first, is Japan is the third largest economy in the world. And at one point they were the second. And with having a big economy, there is certain responsibilities as far as being able to protect your economic interests. Japan has never been able to do that because of their limitations. So they've had to be able to follow into creating multilateral agreements with countries around the world using economic incentive and then having to rely on the U.S. alliance. So Japan has never been able to stray that far from that U.S. alliance because they have not been able to deploy armed forces because it's against their constitution. So it's kind of been a rein on Japanese expansion. And they've done a fairly good job to keep their economy going. They have a lot of troubles right now, but it's basically has limited Japan from being a great power. So it's always been kind of understated compared to other great economic powers. You don't see China or the U.S. being limited. Again, great economic powers, and they're not limited to have a dominant position on the world stage. You don't see that with Japan, and you never saw it with Japan. And Germany is another one that's the same way. So the Ishiba, Prime Minister Ishiba, uses Japanese philosophy again of armed forces. So he wants to. Right now, there's a lot of loose alliances within the system, a lot of bilateral alliance, a web of bilateral alliances, but there's nothing about collective security in the region, nothing similar to NATO Article 5, and that's what he wants to create. So all these loose alliances and agreements would be able to, countries that are willing to participate, it would basically formalize all into one defense alignment and enact collective security with the goal of serving as a deterrent to China and North Korea. So again, there's defense, because again, as I talked about, China prefers bilateral negotiations where they have all the advantages. Something like an Asian NATO, if you're a member, you're going to have some protection from that military bullying from China. So it takes away a lot of China's power in negotiations. They still have their economic power, but let's say an agreement with an Asian NATO, and let's say the U.S. was not involved in it, but an Asian NATO, you still have the economic power of Japan, which is significant. Not as big as China, but it's still significant. So there's some advantage that this would negate a lot of the advantages of China and could actually moderate some of their more aggressive instincts or impulses in the region. I don't think China necessarily at this point, not saying they won't in the future, but at this point they're not necessarily wanting a war. So so there is a lot of potential impact for an Asian type NATO. Now the issue is that many of the Asian nations are part of the global South and would see an Asian NATO as an attempt of the West to influence over developing countries. Now, if you have an Asian NATO, if it's just Japan and let's say South Korea, they are Asian countries, but they are more in the developed range, and they're part of what's called the euphemistically called the rules-based order. They align with the West. But somebody like Indonesia actually aligns with the global South and more of the developing nations. So a alliance led by Japan, or let's say it's an alliance with both Japan and the United States to create this Asian NATO, the global South would look at this as an attempt to extend the influence over the developing nations in the region. China is considered, it's hard to believe, but they still identify themselves as a developing nation and a leader of developing nations. Basically what they are is not really a developing nation, they are an anti-Western nation. As much as they try to get around it, that's what they are. Russia is as well. Maybe some of the other parts of BRICS. BRICS is basically divided into two parts. You've got the non-Western elements led by China and Russia, who tend to be also the most powerful and influential members of BRICS. And then you have countries like India and South Africa, which tend to be non-aligned. So you've got this subset within BRICS. So again, any type of Asian NATO is going to be seen by the global South as just an extension of West's influence over developing nations. And that suspicion is strong in the region. So China uses as basically employing incentives and sanctions to encourage countries to maintain strong ties with it. Basically, there's a economic benefit maintaining strong ties with China, and to dissuade them from joining an alliance. So that's where in the region, where when NATO was created, most of Western Europe knew what the threat was. The threat was the USSR, the Soviet Union, undeniable threat to the West. And it focused everybody, the countries that joined, the initial countries that joined NATO. They saw what the threat was, and they saw their security by sticking together. You don't see that in Asia because, again, you have countries that have, again, you have the global South versus the West, or it's called the rules-based order. You've got that suspicion. And so the global South will tend to lean more towards the China side than it will be towards the Japanese and U.S. side. Then you have ones that they don't see ASEAN, the ASEAN nations, which does include the Philippines, but they look at it as they want strict non-alliance. So they're not. So a lot of those ASEAN countries are not interested in joining any type of military alignment in a counter against China. And then there's other countries that just don't see China as a threat. They see the possibilities of encouraging strong relations with China to be able to incentivize them to be able to get all the economic benefits of China and not have to face the ire of it. So not all the countries in Asia view China as a threat like it was when NATO was created, when nearly everybody saw what the actual threat was. You don't have that in Asia. So in the aftermath of World War II, again, going back to World War II, and this kind of goes into some of my other discussions, and you'll see a paper coming out this week too on this. It'll be out on Monday, I believe. Aftermath of World War II, there's many countries in the region that hold unfavorable views of the Japanese due to their actions during the war. The Japanese were pretty brutal, to say the least, and they were brutal in Korea. They were brutal in China. They're brutal throughout many parts of the region. And many countries in the world, probably stoked by the Soviets and the Russians, but they feel like the Japanese have had a lack of remorse over the war and have not fully atoned for their actions, which again we're brutal. There's no hiding that. And they don't feel like the Japanese have atoned and shown enough lack of remorse for what they did. So any NATO organization, Asian NATO, cannot be led by Japan because Japan doesn't have the moral authority to do that. And this extends to is South Korea and Japan have a lot in common. They've got issues with China and they've got issues with North Korea. But for the most part, they weren't enemies, but they weren't talking either. They were not cooperating because of the impacts of the war in World War II. They are just getting to the point that with that a pact that they've signed earlier this year, that they're actually starting to work together where their animosities of the war, because Korea was occupied by the Japanese for, I think, all the way into the early 20s, I think. It was definitely pre-war that the Japanese occupied Korea, and they treated them terribly. And so they were not discussed, even though they had common enemies. So even as an enemy of my enemy is my friend, that wasn't working in the Japanese-South Korean relationship. It's just gotten to the point of that the threat is so significant now because China and North Korea's aggressiveness that that has broken through the bonds of the issues with from World War II. So you're starting to see some breakthrough, but it's just the fact is Japan just doesn't have the moral authority to lead. They are increasing their defense budget to 2% of GDP. They've got some issues with more economic talk, but they've devalued the currency. It's not sure if they can reach 2% because of all the economic headwinds in Japan right now, but they're trying to go to the goal. If Japan goes to 2% of the GDP, it will have the third largest defense budget in the world. They already have a formidable Navy, and they are, again, they have a lot of technology. Their technology is great. Japan could be a nuclear power if it wanted to. It's just a matter of decisions. They have the capability and the technology to do it. I don't want to say quite overnight, but within a year they could be nuclear. They just choose not to be, for obvious reasons. You've got, obviously Nagasaki and Hiroshima. But they will have the biggest defense factor. So they will be by far the biggest Asian-based country in a Asian NATO. So they are the natural leaders. But because, again, when I talk about the global South, the suspicion from that, and the lack of moral, Japan, in the eyes of many Asian countries, do not have the moral authority to be the leader of such an organization. That means the U.S. has to be involved. And so, again, talking back to the pillars of Japanese post-war foreign policy, it's internationalism, and it's the U.S.-Japanese alliance. So obviously they could go through internationalism to create a nation NATO without the U.S., but they lack the authority. And it's hard to see that the third largest GDP in the region, with the third biggest budget or defense budget in the world, is somehow going to play second place to some other country to lead the organization, is highly dubious. So the only one that could supplant Japan from being the leader of the Asian Asia is the United States. The United States obviously plays a role in Asia. So that's the only reason. That would be the only way that a Asian NATO could work in what Prime Minister Ishiba is talking about. And the U.S. has no interest in it. They are wary of it. The U.S. is more interested in continuing this patchwork of alliances and not pursue an Asian NATO-like alliance. So the issue basically seems dead. It has a lot of benefits that in the U.S. policy to create these loosely formed alliances. Because they are loosely formed, they have different levels of commitment. They have different agreements of what they will and won't do, where a single formed collective alliance would have a strong impact to deter China that these small patchworks cannot. But the U.S. has no interest at this point. The point of view from the U.S. is not overly clear, but I suspect because the U.S. feels like they would be hemmed in to an alliance in a region that, again, doesn't necessarily view the same security issues. They have basically different views of China. So it's like I think the U.S. does not want to get himself hemmed in to a Article 5 agreement where it has to go to war over something that maybe it doesn't necessarily agree, or maybe doesn't completely trust the motives of some of these countries in Asia. So I kind of understand the U.S.'s position, but also the idea of a NATO would negate a lot of China's advantages in the region. But again, if you go into, let's say, somebody like Vietnam joins in and they go into a border dispute with China, does the U.S. really want to get dragged into having to go to North Vietnam? It's not North Vietnam, but Northern Vietnam, to help fight a border war with China. I think the U.S. is just looking at such a organization would lose the flexibility of the United States. All right, so take me back. I love you. President Erdogan, maybe. So I try to do a fake quote there. Basic background of this is Turkey back in 2017 concluded an arms deal. And go back. Turkey is a NATO nation. It's not part of the EU, but it is a NATO nation. President Erdogan of Turkey signed a $2.5 billion arms deal agreement with Russia to acquire the advanced S-400 surface-to-air missile system. Now, the reason why Turkey said they did this was they were not getting favorable terms from the United States and other European countries for an air defense system that they wanted, so they went to the Russians. It is suspected that a lot of this is based around the failed coup attempt in 2016, where Erdogan blamed the United States and the European Union for playing a role in the failed coup attempt. And just as he feels they disrupted the internal workings of Turkey, that if he does something like this is going to cause chaos within Europe, NATO, um, and with the United States, which the United States is in NATO, but I'm thinking from the arms agreements. So they signed the 2.5, and the U.S. warned them, says, you sign this deal, there will be consequences for doing this. So Turkey was already suspicious. Erdogan was, he's been president for quite some time, and he draws a lot of suspicion from the U.S. and European countries. They don't completely trust his instincts and his goals as he fights a brutal campaign against the Kurds and their vie for independence. He has intervened in the Syrian war, but not necessarily serving or helping the U.S. interests against the Islamic State. Not saying Turkey is a Islamic State supporter, but Turkey entered the Syrian war for basically to take its war to the Kurds and not necessarily helping the United States defeat the Islamic State in Syria. There's arguments about the Muslim Brotherhood. He used the Turkish diaspora in Germany. He tried to turn them against the at the time the Chancellor's Angela Merkel from with her election conflict. So he is not, or not conflict, her election is, so he's viewed suspiciously by Europe, and there are concerns about some of the human rights records, especially after the coup. There was a lot of we'll call it extrajudicial punishment meted out, and not the rule of law, which is one of the reasons why it's hung up Turkey's European Union application, which has been out there for the better part of 10 years. Not quite 10 years, but a better part of 10 years. So there is a lot of suspicion about Turkey. Turkey's decision, so again, coup in 2016, 2017, they signed this agreement. Turkey signed this agreement knowing that what Russia was. Russia had seized the Crimea from Ukraine in 2014 and was running basically a quasi-partial occupation through its proxy forces inside the Donbass. And he signed an agreement with these Russians. And the U.S. or the alliance had already agreed to do 2% of their GDP to be committed towards defense spending, which again, to counter the Russians now, all but three of the NATO nations completely ignored that agreement, but they did it anyway. But Turkey knew when it signed the agreement in 2017, he knew what the Russians were. He knew that they had already interfered in Ukraine, and he had signed that agreement. The U.S. warned them, saying, don't do it, and they did it anyway. And the biggest stick in the U.S. retaliation was the F-35 Lightning II fighter program. Turkey was one of the original signers, and they were a financial partner and a production partner in F-35 production. The U.S. warned them, if you take delivery of these missiles, you will be out of the F-35 program. Turkey took delivery in 2018 of the first 4 missiles. In 2019, July 2019. I have to look at my notes here. So the U.S. kicked them out of the F-35 program. That means they were no longer involved in manufacturing. Of course, they didn't have to do any more financing. And they had an order of 100 of the new F-35A versions, which is, we call it the Air Force version. So that was I call it the Air Force version because there's a vertical takeoff and landing, which often is called the Marine version. And then there's the aircraft carrier version, which is the F-35C. So they had an order for 100 of the Air Force version, and so they were kicked out of the program when they took those took development of those, took ownership of those missiles. The reason why is NATO did not want a Russian system integrated into NATO air defense. So there's no way that the NATO was going to allow Turkey to start working within NATO in air defense when they have a Russian-based system in activation. The other part was the U.S. was concerned that a S-400 system operating inside Turkey and Turkey receiving the F-35, that the Russians would be able to get information from those S-400s to try to develop a weakness or identify a weakness or something else or gain secrets of the F-35. So it was just too risky to the United States. So they said, okay, you're out of the program. So when this failed to deter Turkey from continuing to take a delivery of these S-400 missiles, a sanctions protocol was created and signed in December 2020 that basically reduced any type of U.S. Licensing agreements, basically the ability of Turkey to make U.S. weapons under license inside Turkey. Those were taken away. They sanctioned one of the primary defense contractors inside Turkey as additional punishment. So basically they were out of the program. So Turkey decided to develop its own fighter called the TF-Con, which they call fifth generation stealth fighter. Okay. Don't think it has the capability of the F-35, and I don't think anybody advertises it as such. But they started building a new fighter because all they had was aging F-16s, and I think they had F-5s as well. So they had to find something to replace the F-35. So again, they were limited at this point of what they could do. Now, what happened was Turkey comes back and says, all right, Sweden applies for NATO membership, so does Finland. Turkey holds up Sweden's application for, I think it was over lights human rights records, basically Turkey being light on human rights records and insulting Turkey over it. And I think some of their actions over, there's a Kurd organization that Turkey just demanded that every country list them as a terrorist group, and Sweden did not. So the Turkey held up Sweden's application to NATO for well over a year. So Turkey, in return for signing up for or allowing the accession of Sweden to NATO, the U.S. offered them new software packages for their old F-16s, or upgrade packages, not software packages, upgrade packages for their existing older F-16s, and offered to sell them 40 new F-16s. And in trade, Turkey allows Sweden to join NATO. A little quid pro quo going on. So a little horse trading going on to be able to get what they wanted. But Turkey still had the issue is they had started expressing interest in re-entering the F-35 program. And these discussions started back in 2022. Tells you that the TF-Con is not meeting the demands of what it wants. Also, some of its, for example, its arch rival, Israel, actually operates the F-35 as well. So Turkey kind of wants in this program. The U.S. has said they are willing to do this. Now, the only reason they can do this, Turkey could even approach the U.S., is that Turkey deactivated and have stored their S-400 system. So it's not integrated. You don't have to worry about NATO integration or anything like that. So Turkey's trying to find a way forward with this program. And they come back and says, what would it take to get us back into the F-35 program? The U.S. seems to be open to the idea. So Turkey, a former defense minister, came up with an idea of maybe Turkey shipped their initial or to ship all their S-400s to Pakistan or India. Russia has close ties with both countries. They don't feel like Russia would object. Now, this is an important part. The U.S. does very much the similar thing, is Turkey cannot sell those weapons or trade ownership of those weapons to any third party unless Russia agrees. U.S. runs something very similar. That's why many countries in Europe have their own weapons, and they want to allow them to attack targets deeper inside Russia as part of the Ukraine war, but they can't because the U.S. hasn't given permission. It's because any weapon system that is either produced or uses U.S. technology, U.S. has to approve how those weapons are used or where they're sent to. Russians run very much the similar thing. So this is not a Russian-U.S. thing. This is something that both countries use. So that means that so initially when the idea was sending them to Pakistan or India, they felt like, okay, Russia shouldn't object to this. Well, it never went that far because the Turkish government basically said, no, we're not doing that. So it's kind of interesting why they decided to do that, because do they want to hold on to the S-400s as a potential bargaining chip to get more concessions out of NATO or the United States at some point by threatening, once they're in the F-35 program, they got deliveries, they turn on the missiles, bring them back out of storage, and cause all types of problems with it. So are they wanting them to use it as some other leveraging chip so they don't want to get rid of them? Maybe that's a possibility. So they did come up with the ideas that, okay, Turkey says, we will store the missiles at a location, at a single location, and you can monitor, the U.S. can monitor them to make sure that they're not being turned on. You have exactly know where they're at. And you will know that they're not active, and you'll know where every single missile is and every single sensor truck, radar truck. You'll have complete access, complete understanding where it's at. Well, the U.S. was no, and so Turkey said, well, why? Because Greece does. They have Russian S-300 missiles, and the difference is that Turkey, I talked about all the things that Russia had done when Turkey finally agreed to buy those missiles, the S-400s from Russia. Greece does have Russian S-300s. They are stored, and the U.S. is aware of where they're stored. The difference is Greece didn't go out and purchase those missiles. Greece acquired those missiles as a way to defuse a situation in Cyprus. So it's not like Greece went out there and tried to pursue purchasing Russian S-300 missiles. They took them to prevent an escalation on a situation in Cyprus. And the way they could do it is to prevent Cyprus from having these S-300s. So Greece took them and they're in storage. So Turkey was like, well, you allow the Greeks to do that. Why can't we do that? Well, the U.S. basically explained the point is, well, Greece had different motivations than Turkey to buy those weapons. And Greece is in the F-35 program, just to add into that. So the U.S. said, no, this doesn't work for us, despite what Turkey says, well, Greece can do it. So the U.S. said, no, not possible. They want the missiles removed from the country. So Turkey came up with a whole different proposal, kind of a in-between proposal, is the U.S. Incirlik Air Base in Turkey, which is a NATO air base. There's a section cordoned off just for the U.S. I think they keep nuclear weapons there. Confirmed or denied, got that, but it was created to store nuclear weapons, and it's suspected that they're still there. So there is a U.S. specific section of this air base. Turkey said, okay, we will send all the S-400s to your section of the air base that you completely control, and we will do that if we can get in the F-35 program. And this is where the Russians come in. The Russians said, yet, no. Sergei Lavrov, the foreign minister of the Soviet Union, says that is not possible to do. You will not do that. And so this is where the problem that Turkey has run into, got themselves into this quandary, is because of that agreement where the Russians have say-so in those weapons and where you can move them, where you can't move them. And Turkey cannot get new weapons while those S-400s are there. now Russia has a say-so in acquisition of advanced weaponry that Turkey can enter into from countries that are in opposition to Russia. So what now is that Russia has leverage inside Turkey over defense procurement rules, and Turkey is a member of NATO. So also that by the fact that they've done this, they've allowed the Russians to have a say-so inside defense policy of a NATO country. And why this matters is, I'll talk about this little other connected dots thing, is NATO has a unanimous consent requirement. So if Turkey is being leveraged by the Russians and NATO's doing something that Russia doesn't like, are they going to pressure Turkey to veto a NATO initiative that is unfavorable to the Russians in exchange for some type of concession from the Russians saying, okay, we'll allow somebody to watch your S-400s or whatever. You talk about suspicion of the European nations. That's where some of the suspicion comes from. What is Turkey's motivation? The other thing that comes into is that where they're kind of getting themselves into this is the Turkey applied for BRICS, which is led by Russia and China, and they kind of are on the anti-Western part of BRICS. The rest are more the unaligned parts of BRICS. That's not an official designation, but you kind of see where the foreign policy is. So Russia is likely to approve BRICS memberships to Turkey just as a way to inflame tensions within NATO. So now what you'll have is that military procurement. Now, the application hasn't been accepted. I'm betting it's going to get accepted unless Turkey pulls out. So what you're going to have is Russia is going to have economic sway over the Turks through BRICS, and they will have military sway through the procurement limitations of the what weapons that Turkey can acquire, because NATO won't sell to them, or will not allow, including the United States, will not allow the sending of weapons because of the existence of those S-400s. So it's now at this point, he is the Turkish president, who is a shrewd international player. He's done some really questionable things, but he's gone in places where other countries aren't willing to go. The Ukraine, the Black Sea grain deal to allow Ukraine wheat to be sold in the world market. He had peace talks with two and came close to having a peace agreement in the spring of 2022. So he's done things that are that other countries won't do. He got himself over the skis where now he's setting himself that the Russians will have sway inside Turkey, and the concern is NATO decisions, Russia could sway NATO decisions by putting pressure on Turkey or offering them incentives. So this has not put Turkey in a good position, and it's just going to only increase the suspicion of Turkey. Now, Turkey in their new program, they want to acquire the F-35 fighters that they originally wanted, probably not the 100. But they also want 20 of the F-35B versions, the Marine version, vertical takeoff and landing, for their new amphibious assault ship. So they have something they really want from the United States. They want to get into the F-35 program. But the S-400s has become an issue. And they can continue to be the issue because the Russians have sway on what can be done with those S-400s. So this is just something where Turkey has allowed themselves an outside influence through an arms contract with an adversary is now limiting their choices, because he got upset over the unproven accusations against the United States over the coup attempt. Now, admittedly, I could see where he sees it, because the European Union and the United States were very much against a lot of Erdogan's decisions. So he might have suspected that they were involved in the coup, but never provided any proof. But then he accuses them. He goes and signs this agreement, and basically because of his reaction to the coup, in many cases you could call overreaction to the coup, he has put Turkey in a compromised position over purchasing these Russian weapons, and now has handcuffed himself as far as what he can get technology-wise. And then he's still going back to the same Russians to join BRICS. It is very problematic. Now, he might be doing all this for leverage. He might be saying, okay, I will get rid of the S-400s and I won't join BRICS, but I want EU membership and I want in the F-35 program. The only problem is he has to find some way to convince the Russians to allow him to do something with the S-400s. It might be the best thing is that he just has to fire all the missiles off into the ocean and, burn the trucks up. I don't know. But anyway, he's put himself in a bad position, and he did it all on his own and signed up with the Russians that he knew were already proven themselves an unquestionable character after the 2014 invasion. So that's it for this week. So I hope this I'm hoping this comes out all right, because I have no freaking clue, because this audio monitor, so it looks like it's recorded okay, so we'll see. So I apologize for any technical parts of this. If you hear them on your end, I'll test it. But again, I apologize. I want to thank you again for everybody who has continued to support my work. All the people that are new, followers and subscribers, thank you. With the new paid subscribers, thank you as well. It's very much appreciated. I am still having all types of problems with YouTube, and it's to the point that I stopped producing I used to do these things called video samples 1 and 2. And I would do it for everyone. So I produce 6 of those a week. And they used to do really well on YouTube because YouTube has that shorts version. So the idea is I'm going to create this video sample, get some exposure to my work, and maybe eventually draw people over to maybe watch the main videos on YouTube or come over to Substack and see my work. Yeah, not really getting a lot of response. Well, something happened, and my understanding is there's other users that have the same issues. I think with the upcoming election in the U.S. that the YouTube has tightened up the rules on disinformation is what their excuse they're using. But they changed the algorithm, and there's other users that's running into the same thing, is that their information is highly throttled. So I think YouTube is going after the small content providers, though I'm not sure, but that's kind of the impression I'm getting. Well, my views went down 95% on YouTube. I've talked about it before. It used to be the West Philippine Sea newsletter, especially during Balacaton, could easily get 2,500 views. I looked at my last 15 postings got, I think, a total of 11 views. So it's not getting any better. Most of them are 0 views. I had one that got a whole 4 views. Where on the other side, you go to Rumble, and the Rumble videos are doing really well. Still not drawing a lot of attention back over to Substack, but they're viewing pretty well, and I'm monetized. I'm not monetized for very much, but I'm making something. Making a little bit of money. Cents. But it's like nothing like I'm getting on YouTube. I'm not being throttled. That obviously, if you're going in there the day before, you can sit there and put your videos out there, and you can get 400 to 1,000 views for a short, and maybe anywhere from 15 to 100 on a full-size video, to go to a mass majority are getting 0. So I stopped posting the shorts. So what I've done is I've started posting the short videos directly from Substack to notes and skipping it. So everybody's getting 6 fewer emails from me a week. My views are dropping because of that, because just, me just creating a short would create probably let me counting here, probably almost 800 views a week. So my views are going to drop on Substack, but I went back and read some of the algorithm rules on Substack, and it looks like views doesn't necessarily push you up in the algorithm. So I'm going to test that, see how that goes. But I'm not sending as many, not clogging up people's email boxes like I used to, cut down some. So that is something new I started this week. So you can still see my video shorts. They're just posted on notes, and you don't get them on email. So, all right. So thank you very much. I apologize for any technical difficulties with this particular broadcast. And thank you very much. Contact me on Substack if you would like to discuss what's talked about, or just want to have questions about my work. Feel free to contact me on Substack. So I hope all of you have a great rest of your weekend and have a great week looking forward. Have a great week, great night. Thank you.